Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are at installment number 5 in our story of David. I'm calling this one Highs to Lows. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 18. So the last couple of weeks in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we looked at the famous David slaying Goliath story that we all grew up with as children or heard, whether we're church folks or not, in our growing up. That's a story that is universal. And I want to bring back to our attention what David was thinking before his battle. He said in chapter 17, verse 46, "Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. There is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." So David wants to be certain the world gives God the glory and know that the battle is the Lord's. And as I said, this was the perspective in David's whole life. One thing I didn't get to last time, and I want to just put this in here, is let's talk about the giants we run into. And we maybe listed some of them. I think I asked you to bring them up. And maybe you thought of some giants in your lives of being health problems, financial problems, relationship problems, loneliness, mistreatment, fear, discouragement, guilt. You might have your own list to add to that. The point I want to make is we all face giants in our lives. All of us. It's just the human condition. And here's 3 things we can possibly do when we confront our giants. We can run from them, like the Israelites did. Every time Goliath appeared, they would run. We could try to get somebody else to fight for them, like Saul did. Or we can face them in faith, like David did. And remember, the battle is the Lord's, not ours. Our part in the battle is to trust the Lord, to trust his power, like David did. Okay, let's just continue in the story of David. Because after he made that statement that the Lord saves, the battle is the Lord's, he did take on Goliath and was victorious. So right after David killed Goliath, things are looking good for him. Like David is beginning a new chapter in his life, we begin a new chapter here, chapter 18. Verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. We're going to see more of Jonathan. Jonathan is King Saul's son. So he would be the heir apparent in the normal circumstances. We know differently. We know that God has chosen David to succeed Saul. But Jonathan is the son of Saul. So after he finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. They became very close. He loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. So David is now full-time part of the kingdom, the king. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So we'll talk later about David and Jonathan. Right now I wanted to focus on verse 2, that David stayed with Saul. In verse 5, whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. Sounds good so far. David is getting a name for himself. When the men were returning from home after David had killed the Philistine, the Goliath, the women came out from all of the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So the people loved him. He was a star. He went from a raw recruit to high rank and later company commander in no time. Not just battling against that one famous battle with Goliath, but fighting the enemy and being successful. So how would young David handle this sudden success? A lot of folks, especially young, would lose their balance and perspective with such a fast rise to the top. And with so much fame and adoration he was given, it could have really gone to his head. But David kept a level head. Look at verse 5. It says, whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully. The Greek word translated successfully means even more. It means he acted with wisdom. David did it with wisdom. He behaved himself wisely. Wisdom which brings success. So David kept a level head, but Saul didn't. We see in verse 9, let's start with verse 8. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. That was the Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. So we have a jealous king. David's love from the people would feed on the king's paranoia. Saul went from angry to severe anxiety about losing the kingdom. And then we read this, verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul has turned violent. He tried to kill David. Here's David. He was loyal, obedient, performed his duties wisely and faithfully, never bragged that he was going to be the new king, never tried to take the kingship from Saul, but Saul still treated him the way he did. Why? The next verse gives us some more of the reason. In 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, Saul said to David, here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. So now it's more than just jealousy. It's just Saul was afraid of David. But the problem wasn't really the loyal, obedient David. It was the God was taking the kingdom from Saul. Saul was figuring out who was that person better than himself God had in mind. David was the divinely designated king Samuel told Saul about. So did Saul think that if he took David's life, Samuel's prediction would be canceled or something like that? God would cancel his plans? I don't know. The more David succeeded, the more Saul dreaded him. When he couldn't kill David himself, he put him into battles, hoping the Philistine would kill him. All the Philistines attacking him, surely someone is going to do him in. Okay, now David did not marry the oldest daughter, but he did marry another daughter, Michal, who was in love with him. Saul was all for it with the same hope in mind that David would be killed. Verse 21 says, I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So David got the girl, but he was not killed, like Saul was hoping for. I have skipped some verses of us reading them, but that's what happened in those verses. Now we're going to jump to verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So let's review. David's great success, and the people love him. He's a great success. Saul tried to kill him during one of his crazy moments, and then Saul tried to have him killed, but all this is backfired, and what happens next? Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. Now it's gone to a much more serious level. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you." So Jonathan goes to see David. "Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out." So Saul has put a contract out on David's life. The king's goal to eliminate David has ramped up to the point where he's telling everyone of his intentions. We just read that David has a good ally, Saul's son Jonathan, and Jonathan goes even further. Verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. So this is great news. Saul has sworn he will not kill David. It looks like David can finally be at peace. David's back in Saul's good graces. David's able to do what he does best, which is fight for Israel against the enemy. But, there's always a but, unfortunately, Saul's vows held about as much water as a rusty bucket. Chapter 9, verse 9, 1 Samuel, or verse 9 of chapter 19. "But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape." And then we read, "Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, 'If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed.' So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped." This was Saul who had just done an oath, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." And then he breaks that oath so soon. Isn't that awful? So David was thinking that the bad times are over. He can finally relax and concentrate on his battling. And then you come home and be with your wife, be with your king. But before you know it, he's dodging spears thrown from the king. His house isn't safe. He needs the help of his wife, and he escapes. It says he fled and escaped. David's now on the run. He must leave everything. He's about to spend years on the lam. His troubles have really just begun. We'll see he has years of trouble ahead. This is a time of testing for David, isn't it? Let's think about our own lives. I don't imagine anyone has had it as rough as David, where our lives are at stake in this kind of situation. But isn't the human condition to fall into rough times? It can especially be bad when bad times follow good times. David was on a real high there, and then bad times. Things had been going great for him. but now he's in a low. Has that ever happened for you? What gets us or would get us through the lows after good times? A few truths from David's story could be helpful. Some truths from David's story. First one that comes to my mind is having a friend helps us face whatever comes our way. For David, this was Jonathan. We'll look at that more closely next week. But in what we've read, we saw he had a friend. Also, a positive attitude and wisdom are the best defenses. A good response to opposition is to keep your cool. It's not always easy to do, but it is a good thing to try to attain. Keep your cool. That's a good response. The best response to opposition is to let God fight our battles. And that leads us to the greatest truth. Sometimes we need to live one day at a time and trust God. Take things as they come and trust God to prove himself faithful. We're going to see that in the days ahead for David. He really is in a situation where he's living one day at a time. So David wrote Psalm 37. I mentioned he wrote many of the Psalms in the Old Testament. He wrote Psalm 37 during this time. I'm going to read the first 4 verses. And where are they? Come on. Do not fret because of evil men, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. David is always trusting in the Lord. So next time we'll read how David's troubles were still not over. From what we already read, we see he lost so much already. In just a matter of days, David lost his position, lost his home, lost his wife, almost lost his life more than once. But we're going to see it in the future here. He's going to lose his mentor Samuel, his friend Jonathan, and even his self-respect. Will he survive, and how? So we will take that up. In the meantime, you all be safe, and may the Lord be with you.